Welcome to the Whispered Ages. This episode is about the medieval year, a day in the life of a world without months. We appreciate your support for this channel. Please consider liking and subscribing. Now on with the episode. Imagine, for a moment, that you are waking, not to an alarm, not to the glow of a screen, not to the insistent vibration of a device demanding your attention. You are waking in a small house, perhaps a single room shared with family, in a village whose name would mean nothing to anyone living more than a day's walk away. The air is cold, the darkness is complete, or nearly so, broken only by the faint ember glow of a fire banked for the night. And then, from somewhere beyond the walls comes a sound. A bell. It is not a cheerful bell, nor an urgent one. It is deep and slow, a bronze voice speaking across the fields and through the shuttered windows, announcing nothing so simple as an hour. It is announcing a moment in the eternal rhythm of prayer, a call that has sounded in this place for generations, a sound your grandparents heard and their grandparents before them. You do not check a clock to see if the bell is accurate. There is no clock to check. The bell is the time. The bell is how you know that the night has passed its deepest point, that the monks in the distant abbey are rising to pray, that the world continues its ancient turning. This is how time began each day for millions of people across medieval Europe, not with numbers, not with precision, but with sound and sensation. Time was not something you read, it was something you heard, something you felt in your body, something woven into the fabric of community life so thoroughly that extracting it would be like trying to remove the rhythm from music. We live today in a world saturated with time. We carry it in our pockets, wear it on our wrists, display it in the corners of every screen. We measure our days in hours and minutes and sometimes seconds. We are late or early, on time or behind schedule. We optimize and synchronize. We treat time as a resource to be managed, a commodity to be spent wisely or wasted foolishly. But for the people of medieval Europe, time was something altogether different. It was not a grid to be filled or a line to be followed. It was a living thing, breathing with the seasons, stretching and contracting with the sun, punctuated by the sacred and the communal, rather than the personal and the precise. To understand what a day felt like in the medieval world, we must first unlearn almost everything we think we know about time. We must set aside our digital certainties and enter a realm of beautiful ambiguity, where the question of what time is, it would have seemed strange, even meaningless. The answer would not have been a number. It would have been a description. It is after Lords. It is nearly the third hour. The sun is halfway to its height. The evening star has risen. Time was relational, embedded in context, inseparable from the natural world and the sacred calendar that gave meaning to human existence. Consider the simple act of measuring an hour. For us, an hour is an hour, 60 minutes, 3600 seconds, invariable whether it falls in the depths of winter or the height of summer, whether we are in Norway or Nigeria. But in the medieval world, hours were not equal. They were not abstract units divorced from the turning of the earth. They were divisions of daylight and darkness, and since daylight lasts longer in summer than in winter, a summer hour was literally, physically longer than a winter hour. An hour of work in June might stretch to what we would call 75 minutes, while an hour in December might contract to 45. This was not sloppiness or error. This was a fundamentally different understanding of what time was for. Time existed to organize human activity in harmony with nature, not to impose an artificial regularity upon it. The technology of timekeeping reflected this philosophy. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that the philosophy emerged from the technology available. Mechanical clocks, the kind that tick and tock and divide the day into equal segments, did not exist for most of the medieval period. They began to appear in the 13th century, large and expensive devices installed in cathedral towers and town squares, marvels of engineering that often broke down and required constant maintenance. Even when they worked, they were not particularly accurate by our standards. A clock that gained or lost 15 minutes a day was considered acceptable, and in any case, most people never saw these clocks. They lived in villages and hamlets far from any town large enough to afford such a wonder. For them, time remained what it had always been, The sun, the bells, the rhythms of labor and rest. Sundials existed, of course, and had existed since antiquity, but a sundial requires sunlight, which is not always available in the cloud-covered skies of northern Europe. It also requires the ability to read the markings, which assumed a level of education not universal among the peasantry. Water clocks, too, were known, devices that measured time by the steady dripping of water from one vessel to another. But these were rare, expensive, and required constant attention to keep functioning. They were found in monasteries and royal courts, not in the homes of farmers or craftsmen. So how did ordinary people know when to wake, when to work, when to eat, when to sleep? The answer is both simple and profound. They listened. They watched. They felt. The human body, left to its own devices, has a remarkable capacity to track time. We wake when we have slept enough. We grow hungry when our bodies need food. We tire as the day wanes. Medieval people, living without artificial light to extend the evening and without alarm clocks to interrupt natural sleep cycles, were far more attuned to these bodily rhythms than we are today. They rose with the dawn because the dawn brought light and there was work to be done. They rested at midday because the sun was hot and the body needed respite. They slept when darkness fell because there was little else to do and candles were expensive. But beyond the body there was the community. And the community had bells. The bells of medieval Europe were not mere decorations or occasional announcements. They were the heartbeat of social life, the shared pulse that synchronized a world without watches. Every church had bells. Every monastery had bells. And these bells rang not randomly, but according to a pattern, a schedule, a rhythm that everyone within earshot understood. The bells told you when to pray, when to work, when to rest, when to gather. They marked the great events of life, births and deaths, weddings and funerals, fires and invasions. They called the faithful to Mass and warned the community of danger. In a world without mass communication, the bells were the broadcast system, the shared frequency on which everyone was tuned. The sound of bells carried far across the medieval landscape. In the still air of morning or evening, a bell might be heard for miles, its bronze voice reaching across fields and forests to touch the ears of people who could not see the tower from which it rang. This created a kind of acoustic community, a shared temporal experience that bound together everyone within range. When the bells rang for Vespers, everyone heard them. Everyone knew that the day was drawing toward its close, that evening prayers were being said, that the rhythm of sacred time continued its eternal turning. This was time as communion, time as connection, time as something that happened not to isolated individuals but to communities together. There was no private time in the medieval sense. Time was public, shared, announced to all. Your experience of the day was not fundamentally different from your neighbor's experience, because you both heard the same bells, worked the same fields, observed the same feasts. This created a solidarity, a sense of living in common, that is difficult for us to imagine in our age of personalized schedules and individual time zones. Yet we should not romanticize this world too thoroughly. The medieval experience of time had its frustrations as well as its comforts. Without precise timekeeping, coordination was difficult. Meetings were vague. Appointments were approximate. If you agreed to meet someone at the third hour, you might wait a long time, because neither of you knew exactly when the third hour had arrived. Trade and commerce required patience. Travel required flexibility. The entire pace of life was slower, not because people were lazy or inefficient, but because the infrastructure of precision simply did not exist. There was also the matter of power. Those who controlled the bells controlled time itself. The monastery that rang the hours shaped the rhythm of the surrounding countryside. The town that installed a public clock gained a new kind of authority, the ability to regulate work and commerce with unprecedented precision. Time was never neutral. It was always embedded in structures of authority, whether sacred or secular. To ring the bells was to exercise power. To hear the bells was to submit to that power, to accept the rhythm imposed from above. And yet, for all its limitations and hierarchies, the medieval experience of time had a quality we might envy. It was time with texture, time with meaning, time that was never merely empty duration to be filled. Every hour had its prayer, every day had its saint, every season had its labor. Time was not a blank canvas but a rich tapestry, woven with story and significance. To live through a medieval year was to journey through a landscape of memory and meaning, where every turning of the calendar brought familiar faces and familiar tasks, where the past was always present and the future was not an unknown country but a return to what had been. The bells are still ringing, in some places. The sun still rises and sets, the seasons still turn, and somewhere, perhaps, in the quiet moments between our scheduled appointments and our digital notifications, we might still hear an echo of that older time, that slower rhythm, that world where the first sound of morning was not an alarm but a call to prayer. The monks were always the first to wake, long before the peasants stirred in their cottages, long before the craftsmen opened their workshops. The religious communities of medieval Europe were rising in the darkness to begin the cycle of prayer that would structure not only their own days but, in rippling waves of sound and influence, the days of everyone around them. The system was ancient, codified in the rule of Saint Benedict in the 6th century, though its roots stretched back further still to the Desert Fathers of early Christianity, and beyond them to Jewish traditions of fixed prayer times. Benedict had prescribed a rhythm of 8 daily offices, 8 moments of collective worship distributed across the 24 hours, each with its own character and its own purpose. These were the canonical hours, the divine office, the liturgy of the hours, and they became the skeleton upon which medieval time was hung. The first office was Matins, sometimes called vigils, the great night prayer that began in the small hours when darkness was still complete. The exact timing varied by season and by local custom, but it was always deep in the night, often around 2 or 3 in the morning by our reckoning. The monks would rise from their beds, still drowsy, and make their way through cold corridors to the church, where they would chant psalms and readings by candlelight. This was the longest and most elaborate of the offices, a substantial service that might last an hour or more. It was a deliberate disruption of natural sleep, a sacrifice of bodily comfort for spiritual discipline, a way of sanctifying even the darkest hours of night. After Matins came Lauds, the office of dawn, timed to coincide with the first lightening of the eastern sky. Where Matins had been somber and penitential, Lauds was joyful, a celebration of the returning light, a metaphor for resurrection and hope. The psalms sung at Lauds were psalms of praise, and the mood was one of gratitude for having survived another night, for being granted another day of life. Then came Prime, the first hour, said as the sun cleared the horizon and the day's work was about to begin. This was a short office, a quick dedication of the coming labor to God's service. After Prime, the monks would typically break their fast and proceed to their various tasks, whether copying manuscripts in the scriptorium, working in the gardens, caring for the sick, or teaching the young. The morning continued with Terce, the third hour, falling roughly around mid-morning. This brief pause for prayer marked the point when the day's work was well underway, a moment to step back from labor and remember the sacred purpose underlying all human activity. Tradition held that the Holy Spirit had descended upon the apostles at the third hour on Pentecost, and so Terce carried associations of inspiration and empowerment. Sext came at the 6th hour, at midday, when the sun stood at its highest. This was a time of rest in many communities, especially in the warmer months. The midday meal would follow, and perhaps a period of quiet reading or sleep. Sext acknowledged the weariness of labor, the need for respite, the rhythm of exertion and recovery that characterizes all sustainable work. None, the 9th hour, fell in mid-afternoon, around 3 o'clock by our measure. This hour had special significance, because tradition held that Christ had died on the cross at the 9th hour. None was thus tinged with solemnity, a remembrance of sacrifice, a meditation on mortality. It also marked a point when the day began its decline, when the light started its long fade toward evening. Vespers, the evening office, was perhaps the most beloved of all. Sung as the sun set, often with the church filling with golden light through western windows, Vespers had a beauty and a poignancy that touched even the least devout. The Magnificat, Mary's song of praise, was sung at Vespers, and the incense rose with the prayers into the darkening air. This was the office that most often drew laypeople to participate, the public face of monastic prayer, the moment when the sacred rhythm of the cloister touched the secular world beyond. Finally, Compline closed the day. This was the last office before sleep, a gentle, quiet service of protection and trust. The monks would sing the beautiful antiphon Salve Regina or one of the other Marian hymns, commending themselves to the Virgin's care through the vulnerable hours of night. Then they would retire in silence, the great silence that would not be broken until after Matins, hours of wordless rest in which the community slept as one. This eightfold pattern was the ideal, the template, the aspiration. In practice, there was considerable variation. Some monasteries combined offices, especially Matins and Lauds, which were often said back to back. Some communities adjusted the timing to accommodate local conditions or particular devotions. The secular clergy, priests serving in parishes rather than monasteries, often said a simplified version of the offices, and laypeople were not expected to observe all 8 hours, though many tried to attend at least Vespers and perhaps Prime. But even for those who never entered a church, the canonical hours shaped daily life. The bells that rang for each office were heard throughout the surrounding countryside. A peasant working in the fields would hear the bells for terce and know that the morning was advancing. A merchant traveling the roads would hear the bells for noon and know that the afternoon was wearing on. The bells created a shared temporal framework, a common rhythm that synchronized communities across distances. The hours were not fixed by the clock, but by the sun. This meant that they shifted with the seasons. In summer, when daylight stretched long, the hours between Prime and Compline were extended, each one lasting longer than its winter counterpart. In winter, when darkness came early, the hours compressed, the offices crowding closer together as the brief daylight hurried past. This was not seen as a problem to be solved, but as a natural accommodation to the created order. God had made the seasons. The Church adapted its rhythm to God's design. This seasonal flexibility had practical consequences. A summer hour of work was genuinely longer than a winter hour. Laborers hired by the hour would work more in June than in January, and this was understood and expected. Contracts sometimes specified not just hours but temporal hours or equal hours, distinguishing between the flexible liturgical hours and the theoretical equal hours that scholars discussed but ordinary people rarely used. The whole system required a tolerance for ambiguity that would drive modern managers to distraction, but that medieval people accepted as simply the way things were. The canonical hours also created a geography of time. A traveler moving east or west would notice that the bells rang at slightly different moments relative to the sun's position. A journey of any significant distance was also a journey through time, a passage from one acoustic community to another. This was not standardized. There was no medieval equivalent of time zones. Each community kept its own time, based on its own observation of the sun, its own ringing of the bells. The result was a patchwork of local times, loosely aligned but never precisely synchronized. For the monks themselves, the canonical hours were not merely a schedule but a spiritual discipline. The constant interruption of work for prayer was meant to prevent any activity from becoming all-consuming, to remind the religious that their ultimate purpose was not productivity but worship. The hours sanctified time, transforming mere duration into an offering. Each moment was oriented toward God, each task performed in the context of prayer. This was the theory, at least. In practice, monks were human, and the records show complaints about brothers falling asleep during Matins, rushing through the Psalms to get back to more interesting work, or simply going through the motions without devotion. But the ideal remained powerful, shaping expectations and aspirations, even when reality fell short. The influence of the canonical hours extended far beyond the monastery walls. The Church encouraged laypeople to observe at least some of the hours, and books of hours, beautifully illuminated prayer books designed for private devotion, became enormously popular among the literate wealthy. These books contained prayers and readings for each of the canonical hours, allowing their owners to participate in the sacred rhythm, even without attending church services. The most famous of these, like the Tres Riches Heures of the Duke of Berry, are masterpieces of medieval art, their calendar pages depicting the labors of each month beneath scenes of aristocratic leisure, or religious celebration. Even for those who could not read, the canonical hours provided a framework for understanding the day. Time was not a continuous flow, but a series of distinct moments, each with its own character and significance. The hours between Lauds and Prime had a different quality than the hours between None and Vespers. Morning was for fresh beginnings, midday for rest and sustenance, afternoon for the long push toward completion, evening for gratitude and reflection, night for sleep and the mysterious vigils of prayer. This gave texture to time, a rhythm of anticipation and arrival, of tension and release. The canonical hours also connected the present to the past and the future. The same psalms sung at Matins in a 12th century English monastery had been sung at Matins in a 6th century Italian monastery, and would be sung at Matins in a 16th century Spanish monastery. The same prayers, the same gestures, the same rising in the darkness, the same walking through cold corridors, the same flickering candlelight. To participate in the divine office was to join a chain of prayer stretching back through centuries and forward into an indefinite future. Time was not just organized but consecrated, woven into the eternal purposes of God. Meanwhile, beyond the monastery walls, the rhythm of the canonical hours blended with other rhythms, the rhythms of work and rest, of eating and sleeping, of the seasons and the weather. The bells provided the framework, but life filled in the details. A farmer might pause at the sound of the sex bell to eat his midday bread and cheese, but he would not stop working simply because a bell rang if the hay needed to be brought in before the rain. The sacred rhythm was important, but it was not absolute. It coexisted with the demands of survival, the urgencies of the material world, the unpredictable needs of animals and crops and children. This coexistence was not always comfortable. There were tensions between the timeless claims of the sacred and the pressing demands of the secular. But for most people, most of the time, the two rhythms complemented each other, the bells providing a stable framework within which the improvisations of daily life could unfold. The canonical hours were not a cage but a trellis, a structure that supported growth without constraining it entirely. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the bells rang for vespers, the medieval day began its gentle descent toward night. The work of the fields was ending. The craftsmen were putting away their tools. The markets were closing. And everywhere, in monasteries and cathedrals and parish churches, voices were rising in the ancient prayers of evening, singing the sun down and the stars up, marking another day's passage in the endless turning of the sacred year. The medieval calendar was not a grid of numbered days but a tapestry of stories. Each date was not merely a position in a sequence but a commemoration, a remembrance, a celebration of someone or something that had marked that day with significance. The year was populated with saints, hundreds of them, each with a feast day, each with a legend, each with a claim on the attention and devotion of the faithful. To know the date was to know whose day it was, whose memory was being honored, whose intercession might be sought. This was the liturgical calendar, the calendar of the Church, and it was the primary way that medieval people organized their year. The numbered days of the month were known, of course, inherited from the Roman calendar, and preserved in legal and administrative documents. But in daily speech and common understanding, time was measured by feasts. A contract might be dated not the 15th of August, but the feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin. Rent might be due not on the 1st of October but at Michaelmas. A fair might be held not in mid-June, but at the feast of St. John the Baptist. The great feasts of the Christian year provided the primary landmarks. Christmas and Easter were the two poles around which the calendar turned, the fixed feast of the Nativity and the movable feast of the Resurrection. Between them stretched the seasons of Advent and Lent, periods of preparation and penitence, and after them came the long green season of ordinary time, punctuated by lesser feasts and local celebrations. But these major feasts were only the beginning. The calendar was thick with commemorations. Every day of the year was dedicated to at least one saint, and often to several. Some of these saints were universal, recognized throughout Christendom. The apostles Peter and Paul, the evangelists Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the early martyrs Stephen and Lawrence, the great doctors of the Church Augustine and Jerome. Others were local, venerated in particular regions or cities. St. Cuthbert in northern England, St. Denis in France, St. Wenceslas in Bohemia. A cathedral or monastery might have its own patron saint, whose feast day was celebrated with special solemnity, drawing pilgrims from miles around. The feast days were not merely religious observances, but social and economic events. Many feasts were holidays in the original sense, holy days on which work was forbidden, or at least discouraged. A medieval peasant might have 40 or 50 such days off per year, not counting Sundays, a number that compares favorably with modern vacation allowances. These were days for attending Mass, for visiting relatives, for participating in communal celebrations. They broke up the monotony of labor and provided regular occasions for rest and festivity. Markets and fairs were often scheduled to coincide with feast days, taking advantage of the crowds that gathered for religious observances. The great international fairs of medieval Europe, at Champagne and elsewhere, were organized around the calendar of saints. Merchants knew that at the feast of Saint Remy, they should be in one town, at the feast of Saint Ayoul in another. The sacred calendar and the commercial calendar were intertwined, each supporting the other. Legal and administrative life also followed the rhythm of feasts. The English legal year was divided into terms named after saints and seasons: Michaelmas term, Hilary term, Easter term, Trinity term. Rents were commonly due at quarter days: Lady Day in March, Midsummer in June, Michaelmas in September, Christmas in December. These dates were fixed points in the year, known to everyone, requiring no numerical specification. To say that a payment was due at Michaelmas was perfectly clear to any medieval listener, as clear as saying it was due on the 29th of September would be to us. The feast days also carried associations, memories, stories. Each saint had a legend, a narrative of holiness and often of martyrdom, that gave meaning to the day. The feast of St. Lawrence recalled his death by roasting on a gridiron, his legendary quip to his executioners that they should turn him over because he was done on that side. The feast of St. Catherine remembered the wheel on which she was tortured, a wheel that miraculously shattered at her touch. The feast of St. Nicholas brought stories of his generosity, his secret gifts to the poor, his protection of children and sailors. These stories were told and retold, in sermons and in popular tradition, keeping the saints alive in communal memory. For medieval people, the saints were not distant historical figures but present intercessors, friends in heaven who could be called upon for help. Each saint had particular specialties, areas of life over which they exercised patronage. Saint Apollonia, whose teeth had been pulled out during her martyrdom, was invoked for toothaches. Saint Blaise, who had saved a child choking on a fishbone, was the patron of throat ailments. Saint Christopher protected travelers. Saint Barbara guarded against lightning and sudden death. To know the calendar of saints was to know whom to call upon in any emergency, to have a directory of heavenly assistants organized by specialty and by date. The feast days also structured memory. When trying to recall when something had happened, a medieval person would not think in terms of numbered dates but in terms of feasts. It was the week after Candlemas. It was 3 days before the feast of St. Martin. It was the year that Easter fell so early. This created a different relationship with the past, one organized around recurring landmarks rather than linear progression. The same feasts came around each year, providing stable reference points against which individual events could be located. This cyclical quality was reinforced by the liturgical readings and rituals associated with each feast. Every year at Christmas, the same gospel was read, the same carols sung, the same scenes enacted in mystery plays. Every year at Easter, the same drama of death and resurrection unfolded, the same vigil kept, the same alleluias sung at dawn. The repetition was not boring but reassuring, a confirmation that the sacred story continued, that the community remained connected to its traditions, that time was not a one-way journey into the unknown, but a spiral returning always to familiar ground. The calendar of saints also connected local communities to the wider church. A village in England and a village in Italy might have little in common, but they shared the same calendar, the same great feasts, the same cycle of commemoration. When the bells rang for the Assumption in August, they rang throughout Christendom. When Lent began, it began everywhere. This created a sense of belonging to something larger than the local, a participation in a universal rhythm that transcended boundaries of language and kingdom. At the same time, the calendar allowed for local variation. Each region, each diocese, each parish might have its own special devotions, its own local saints, its own particular customs for celebrating the common feasts. The universal framework was adapted to local conditions, creating a balance between unity and diversity that allowed the calendar to feel both Catholic and personal. The great feasts were occasions for community gathering on a scale that ordinary Sundays could not match. At Christmas, even the poorest households tried to provide special food, and the lord of the manor might distribute alms to his tenants. At Easter, the entire community came to Mass and received communion, often the only time in the year when ordinary laypeople took the Eucharist. At Corpus Christi, the Blessed Sacrament was carried in procession through the streets, and guilds competed to mount the most impressive pageants. At All Saints and All Souls, the living remembered the dead, visiting graves, lighting candles, praying for the souls in purgatory. These occasions created shared memories, experiences that bound communities together across generations. An old man could remember the Easter of his childhood and know that his grandchildren would experience the same feast, the same rituals, the same stories. The calendar was a mechanism of cultural transmission, ensuring that the essential narratives and practices were renewed year after year, generation after generation. The feast days also provided occasions for negotiating social relationships. The giving of gifts at Christmas and other feasts was not merely generosity, but a performance of social bonds, a way of acknowledging obligations and expressing affection. The feasting that accompanied major holidays brought people together across social boundaries, though always within carefully maintained hierarchies. The Lord feasted his tenants, the master his apprentices, the wealthy their poorer neighbors. These occasions reinforced social structures while also providing moments of release and celebration. The calendar was thus far more than a way of keeping track of time. It was a comprehensive system for organizing social, economic, religious, and emotional life. It told people not just what day it was, but what that day meant, what it demanded, what it offered. It connected the present to the past and the future, the local to the universal, the human to the divine. It was, in a very real sense, the operating system of medieval society, the shared framework that made coordination and communication possible in a world without modern infrastructure. As one feast day gave way to another, as the calendar turned through its annual cycle, medieval people experienced time not as an empty container to be filled, but as a rich narrative already written, a story in which they were participants. Each day had its character, its associations, its place in the larger pattern. Time was not neutral but meaningful, not abstract but embodied in the lives and deaths of the holy men and women whose memories sanctified each passing day. The year turned, and with it turned the work of human hands. For the vast majority of medieval people, those who lived on the land and from the land, the calendar was written not only in saints and feasts, but in soil and seasons. The agricultural year was a cycle of labor, each month bringing its appointed tasks, each season demanding its particular efforts. This was not merely a schedule, but a way of life, a rhythm so deeply embedded that it shaped the very experience of time itself. The famous labors of the months, depicted in countless manuscripts, carved on church doorways, painted on the walls of great halls, provided a visual calendar of this agricultural cycle. These images showed not abstract dates, but concrete activities, the work that defined each portion of the year, the tasks by which each month was known. To look at these images was to see time made visible, duration transformed into action. January was a month of rest and feasting, the brief respite after the Christmas celebrations before the hard work resumed. The images often show figures warming themselves by fires, eating and drinking, enjoying the last of the stored provisions. The fields were dormant, the animals housed, the world waiting for the return of warmth. But even in January there was work, the mending of tools, the repair of buildings, the planning for the year ahead. February brought the first stirrings of agricultural activity. The images show pruning, the careful cutting back of vines and fruit trees to encourage the coming season's growth. This was skilled work, requiring knowledge passed down through generations, an understanding of how plants grew and what they needed. The days were lengthening, the worst of winter past, though cold and rain still dominated. The fields remained too wet to work, but the orchards and vineyards demanded attention. March was the month of plowing, the great turning of the earth that prepared the ground for spring planting. The images show oxen straining at the plow, farmers guiding the heavy wooden implements through the soil, the land opening in long furrows. This was exhausting work, demanding strength and endurance, but it was also hopeful work, the beginning of a new agricultural cycle. The smell of turned earth, the calls of returning birds, the lengthening days all spoke of renewal. April brought sowing, the scattering of seed across the prepared fields. The images show figures with bags of grain, walking the furrows, casting seed with practiced gestures. This was a moment of faith as much as labor, entrusting the precious seed to the earth in hope of harvest. The weather was unpredictable, the risks considerable. Too much rain would rot the seed, too little would leave it parched. Late frosts could kill the tender shoots. The farmer worked and prayed, knowing that the outcome was never fully in human hands. May was traditionally depicted as a month of leisure for the nobility, with images of hawking and hunting, of aristocrats riding through green meadows. But for those who worked the land, May was a month of weeding and watching, of tending the growing crops and hoping for favorable weather. The fields were green now, the winter wheat standing tall, the spring plantings pushing up through the soil. The days were long, the work continuous, the brief respite of early spring already a memory. June brought haymaking, one of the most labor-intensive periods of the agricultural year. The images show figures with scythes, cutting the tall grass in rhythmic sweeps, others raking and turning the cut hay to dry in the sun. This work had to be done quickly, in the brief window of good weather, before the rain could spoil the crop. Hay was essential for feeding livestock through the winter, and a poor hay harvest could mean disaster. The whole community turned out for this work, men and women and children, racing against the weather to bring in the crop. July continued the hay harvest, and began the preparation for the grain harvest to come. The images show the hay being gathered and stacked, the barns filling with the fragrant dried grass. The wheat and rye were ripening in the fields, turning from green to gold, approaching the moment of harvest. The days were at their longest, the sun at its strongest, the work seemingly endless. August was the month of the grain harvest, the climax of the agricultural year. The images show reapers with sickles, bending over the golden stalks, cutting and binding the sheaves. This was the work on which survival depended, the gathering of the bread that would feed the community through the coming year. Every available hand was pressed into service. The work continued from dawn to dusk and beyond, the urgency palpable. A storm could flatten the standing grain, a delay could mean spoilage. The harvest had to be brought in while the weather held. September saw the continuation of the harvest and the beginning of the vintage. The images show grapes being picked, carried in baskets to the presses, trampled underfoot to release their juice. Wine was not merely a luxury but a staple, safer to drink than water in many regions, a source of calories and comfort through the long winter. The grape harvest was festive, a celebration as much as a labor, the culmination of a year's care for the vines. October brought the sowing of winter wheat, the planting that would lie dormant through the cold months and spring to life in the warming days of the following year. The images show the familiar scene of sowing, the farmer once again casting seed across the furrows, beginning the cycle anew even as the current year's harvest was being stored. October also brought the gathering of acorns and beechnuts, food for the pigs that would be slaughtered in the month to come. November was the month of slaughter, the killing of those animals that could not be fed through the winter. The images show pigs being killed and butchered, their meat salted and smoked for preservation. This was bloody, practical work, essential for survival but also tinged with ritual significance. The feast of Saint Martin on the 11th of November was traditionally a time for this slaughter, and the phrase Martinmas goose or Martinmas beef entered the language as terms for the meat prepared at this season. December brought the year full circle, back to the feasting and rest of the Christmas season. The images show baking and brewing, the preparation of the special foods that would mark the holiday. The pig slaughtered in November was now appearing on the table. The grain harvested in August was becoming bread. The grapes pressed in September were becoming wine. The whole year's labor was being consumed in celebration, the stored abundance of the harvest sustaining the community through the darkest days. This cycle was not merely a schedule, but a way of experiencing time. The body knew what month it was by the work it performed. The aching muscles of harvest time, the cold fingers of winter pruning, the sweating labor of haymaking. Each season wrote itself on the body in its own way. Time was not abstract but physical, not measured but felt. The cycle also connected each year to every year before it. The same work returned with the same seasons, generation after generation. A medieval farmer doing the spring plowing was doing what his father had done and his grandfather before him, what his sons would do, and their sons after them. This created a sense of continuity, of participation in something larger than individual life, of belonging to an ongoing story that stretched back into the mists of the past and forward into an indefinite future. The labors of the months were not merely descriptive, but prescriptive. They told people what they should be doing, what the season demanded, what the proper order of things required. To neglect the appointed labor was not just impractical, but improper, a violation of the natural order. The cycle was normative, defining not just what people did, but what they ought to do. This created a particular relationship with time. There was no sense of progress, of moving towards some different future. The goal was not to change, but to maintain, to perform the same labors as well as possible, to hand on the same traditions to the next generation. Time was not an arrow, but a wheel, turning endlessly through the same positions, returning always to where it had been. Yet within this cycle there was also variation. No 2 years were exactly alike. The weather differed, the harvests varied, good years alternated with bad. A late frost might kill the fruit blossoms. A wet summer might rot the grain. A dry autumn might wither the winter planting. The cycle provided the framework, but within that framework there was endless contingency, endless uncertainty, endless dependence on forces beyond human control. This combination of repetition and variation created a particular kind of memory. People remembered not just what happened, but when in the cycle it happened. The great frost was the one that came after Candlemas. The abundant harvest was the one that followed the wet spring. Events were located not in numbered years, but in the recurring pattern of seasons and labors. The cycle was the calendar, and the calendar was the cycle. The agricultural year also shaped the experience of community. The great labors, especially hay harvest and grain harvest, required collective effort. Neighbors worked together, helping each other bring in the crops before the weather turned. This created bonds of mutual obligation, networks of reciprocity that held communities together. The rhythm of the agricultural year was also the rhythm of social life, the occasions for gathering and cooperation that made rural existence sustainable. As the autumn days shortened and the last of the harvest was stored, as the animals were slaughtered and the fields lay fallow, the agricultural year wound down toward its winter rest. The cycle was complete, but it was not finished. It would begin again, as it always had, as it always would, the eternal return of the seasons, the endless turning of the wheel of time. At the same time, beneath the rhythm of saints and seasons, there lay a deeper strangeness in medieval timekeeping, a feature so different from our modern experience that it requires careful attention to understand. This was the distinction between what scholars call temporal hours and seasonal hours, a difference that reveals just how profoundly the medieval relationship with time differed from our own. For us, an hour is an hour. It lasts 60 minutes whether it falls at noon or midnight, in summer or winter, in the tropics or the Arctic. Our hours are equal, abstract, divorced from any natural phenomenon. They are units of measurement, as standardized as meters or kilograms, as independent of context as any scientific constant. But for medieval people, hours were not equal. They were divisions of daylight and darkness, and since daylight lasts longer in summer than in winter, a summer hour was literally longer than a winter hour. The day, from sunrise to sunset, was divided into 12 hours, regardless of how long that period actually lasted. The night, from sunset to sunrise, was similarly divided into 12 hours. In summer, when the days were long and the nights short, the daytime hours stretched while the nighttime hours compressed. In winter, the pattern reversed. This meant that a daytime hour in June, at the latitude of Paris or London, might last what we would call 75 or 80 minutes, while a daytime hour in December might last only 40 or 45 minutes. The difference was substantial, not a minor variation, but a significant change in the experienced duration of each hour. And this was not considered a problem to be solved, but a natural feature of time itself, a reflection of the created order. The reasoning behind this system was practical as much as philosophical. The hours were meant to organize human activity, and human activity was governed by light. You could work when you could see, and had to stop when darkness fell. It made sense, therefore, to divide the available light into equal portions, even if those portions varied in absolute duration from season to season. A worker hired for 3 hours of labor would work for a quarter of the available daylight, regardless of whether that was a long summer quarter or a short winter one. This system, known as seasonal hours or unequal hours, had ancient roots. The Romans had used it, and the medieval world inherited it along with so much else from classical antiquity. The canonical hours of the Church were originally tied to this system, with tertii at the 3rd hour, sext at the 6th, and none at the 9th, each marking a division of the daylight rather than a fixed point on an abstract clock. But there was also another system, known to scholars and increasingly used in certain contexts. This was the system of equal hours or temporal hours, in which each hour lasted the same duration regardless of season. This was the system that would eventually triumph, becoming the universal standard that we still use today. But in the medieval period, it was primarily a scholarly abstraction, used for astronomical calculations and theoretical discussions, but rarely applied to daily life. The coexistence of these two systems created complications. A scholar discussing the movements of the stars would use equal hours, while a farmer discussing the day's work would use seasonal hours. A monastery might ring its bells according to one system while a nearby town tried to implement the other. The confusion was considerable, and it was never fully resolved during the medieval period. The technology of timekeeping reflected this complexity. Sundials, the most common timekeeping devices, naturally produced seasonal hours. The shadow moved across the dial at a rate determined by the sun's position, which varied with the season. A sundial marked for seasonal hours would show the correct time throughout the year, but a sundial marked for equal hours would be accurate only at the equinoxes, when day and night were of equal length. Water clocks, which measured time by the steady flow of water, could in principle produce equal hours, but they were rare, expensive, and unreliable, requiring constant attention and calibration. They were found in monasteries and royal courts, where the resources existed to maintain them, but they were unknown to ordinary people. The mechanical clocks that began to appear in the 13th century were designed to produce equal hours. This was a revolutionary development, a technology that would eventually transform the human relationship with time. But for most of the medieval period, these clocks were rare and unreliable. They were large, expensive, and required skilled maintenance. They were installed in cathedral towers and town squares, where they served as much as symbols of civic pride as practical timekeeping devices. Their accuracy was limited, and they often disagreed with each other and with the sun. The spread of mechanical clocks gradually shifted the balance toward equal hours, but the transition was slow and uneven. In many areas, seasonal hours persisted well into the early modern period. The coexistence of the two systems created a kind of temporal pluralism, different ways of measuring time used for different purposes by different people. This situation is difficult for us to imagine. We are accustomed to a single, universal time, synchronized across the globe, accurate to fractions of a second. The idea that time itself might be measured differently depending on context, that an hour might mean different things to different people, seems almost absurd. But for medieval people, this was simply the way things were. Time was not a single, objective reality, but a practical tool that could be adapted to different needs. The philosophical implications of seasonal hours were profound. Time was not independent of nature, but responsive to it. The hours bent to accommodate the sun, stretching and contracting as the seasons turned. This reflected a worldview in which nature was not something to be conquered or controlled, but something to be accommodated and respected. The rhythms of the natural world were not obstacles to be overcome, but patterns to be followed. This also meant that time was experienced differently in different places. The hours at the latitude of Edinburgh were not the same as the hours at the latitude of Rome. A traveler moving north or south would notice the change, the summer hours growing longer as one approached the pole, shorter as one approached the equator. Time was local, embedded in place, varying with geography as well as season. The practical consequences of this system were considerable. Coordination across distances was difficult when the hours themselves varied. A message saying to meet at the 6th hour would mean different things depending on where and when it was sent and received. Trade and commerce required negotiation and flexibility, an acceptance that precise timing was often impossible. Yet for most people, most of the time, this imprecision was not a serious problem. Life moved slowly. Distances were great. Expectations were modest. If you agreed to meet someone around midday, you would wait until they arrived. Whether that took what we would call 15 minutes or an hour, the whole pace of life was different, shaped by the limitations of the available technology and the assumptions of the culture. The transition from seasonal to equal hours was not merely a technical change, but a cultural transformation. It represented a shift from a time that bent to nature to a time that was independent of it, from a time that was local and variable to a time that was universal and fixed. This transition was still incomplete at the end of the medieval period, but its beginnings were visible in the mechanical clocks that increasingly dominated the soundscape of urban life. Meanwhile, in the countryside, the old rhythms persisted. The farmers and laborers, who made up the vast majority of the population, continued to live by the sun and the seasons, their hours stretching and contracting with the light, their days shaped by the ancient patterns of agricultural work. The bells of the parish church still rang for the canonical hours, marking time in the traditional way, connecting the present to the past in an unbroken chain of sacred rhythm. The tension between these different ways of measuring time would continue for centuries, as the mechanical clock gradually extended its dominion over more and more of human life. But in the medieval period, the older system still held sway, and time remained something fluid, responsive, embedded in the natural world rather than imposed upon it. The experience of time in the medieval world was not merely different in its measurement, but different in its very nature. Where we experience time as linear, as an arrow flying from past through present toward future, medieval people experienced time as circular, as a wheel turning through the same positions again and again, returning always to where it had been. This circular experience was reinforced by everything in medieval life. The agricultural year returned to its beginning each spring. The liturgical year returned to Advent each winter. The same feasts came around, the same saints were commemorated, the same labors were performed. The cycle was not a metaphor but a lived reality, the fundamental structure of temporal experience. This had profound implications for how medieval people understood their place in time. They did not see themselves as moving towards some different future, progressing toward a destination that had never been reached before. They saw themselves as participating in an eternal pattern, playing their part in a story that had been told before and would be told again. The past was not gone, but always returning. The future was not unknown, but already written in the recurring cycle. This created a particular relationship with memory. To remember the past was not to recall something that was over and done, but to anticipate something that would come again. The Feast of Christmas was not merely a commemoration of something that happened long ago, but a participation in an eternal event that happened every year. The harvest was not just this year's harvest, but every harvest, connected to all the harvests that had come before and all that would come after. This cyclical understanding of time was deeply comforting. It provided stability and predictability in a world that was, in many ways, uncertain and dangerous. Disease, famine, war, the countless threats to medieval life were ever present. But the cycle continued. The seasons turned. The feasts returned. Whatever disasters might befall, the pattern would reassert itself. There was something to hold on to, something that would not change, something that connected the living to the dead and the yet-to-be-born. The circular experience of time also shaped identity. A medieval person was not primarily an individual moving through a unique life trajectory, but a participant in ongoing roles and relationships. You were a farmer as your father had been and your son would be, performing the same labors in the same fields, marking the same feasts, hearing the same bells. Your individual story was less important than your place in the larger pattern, your participation in the cycle that had begun before you and would continue after you. This is not to say that medieval people had no sense of linear time, of history as a sequence of events moving from creation toward judgment. The Christian understanding of history was fundamentally linear, a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Creation, fall, incarnation, redemption, apocalypse. This was a narrative that moved forward, that was going somewhere, that would reach a conclusion. Medieval people were aware of this grand narrative and saw themselves as living within it. But this linear understanding of sacred history coexisted with the circular experience of ordinary time. The great narrative was playing out, but within it, the cycles continued. The year turned, the seasons changed, the feasts returned. The linear and the circular were not contradictory but complementary, different aspects of a complex temporal experience that modern people, with our predominantly linear understanding, find difficult to grasp. The circular experience of time also affected how medieval people thought about change. For us, change is natural, expected, often welcomed. We assume that things will be different in the future, that progress will bring improvements, that the new will replace the old. But for medieval people, change was suspicious, potentially dangerous, a disruption of the proper order. The goal was not to change, but to maintain, to preserve the patterns that had been handed down, to ensure that the cycle continued as it always had. This conservatism was not merely a matter of temperament, but a logical consequence of the circular understanding of time. If time is a wheel, then the best position is the one you are in. Moving forward just brings you back to where you started. The wisdom of the past is not outdated, but eternally relevant, because the same situations will recur. Innovation is not progress but deviation, a departure from the proven patterns that had sustained previous generations. This attitude shaped medieval approaches to everything from technology to theology. New ideas were viewed with suspicion. Ancient authorities were cited with reverence. The goal of scholarship was not to discover new truths, but to recover and transmit the wisdom of the ancients. The goal of craftsmanship was not to invent new techniques, but to master the traditional methods. The goal of governance was not to reform, but to restore, to return to the good old ways that had been corrupted or forgotten. Of course, change happened anyway. Medieval society was not static. Technologies improved, populations grew and shrank, kingdoms rose and fell. But these changes were often experienced as deviations from the norm, disruptions of the cycle, problems to be corrected rather than progress to be celebrated. The ideal was stability, continuity, the endless return of the familiar. This circular understanding of time also shaped the medieval experience of community. The community was not just the people currently living, but all who had lived and all who would live, connected by their common participation in the cycle. The dead were not gone, but present, remembered in prayers, commemorated on their feast days, buried in the churchyard where the living walked every Sunday. The unborn were not unknown but anticipated, expected to take up the same roles and perform the same labors that the living had inherited from the dead. This created a sense of temporal community, a solidarity across generations that is difficult for us to imagine. We tend to think of ourselves as living in our own time, connected to the past by memory and to the future by hope, but fundamentally separate from both. Medieval people thought of themselves as living in the same time as their ancestors and descendants, participating in the same eternal cycle, part of a community that transcended the boundaries of individual lifespans. The rituals of medieval life reinforced this temporal community. The Feast of All Souls, when the living prayed for the dead, was a moment of explicit connection across the boundary of death. The practice of anniversary masses, paid for in advance to be said for the donor's soul after death, created an ongoing relationship between the living and the dead. The very stones of the church, built by previous generations and expected to endure for generations to come, were physical embodiments of temporal continuity. This circular, communal experience of time had its costs as well as its comforts. It could be stifling, limiting, resistant to necessary change. It could trap people in roles and relationships that did not suit them, denying them the possibility of becoming something different. It could justify oppression and inequality by appealing to the way things had always been. The weight of tradition could be crushing as well as sustaining. But for those who lived within it, the circular experience of time provided something that our linear, progressive understanding often lacks: a sense of meaning and belonging that did not depend on individual achievement or personal progress. You mattered not because of what you accomplished, but because of your place in the pattern, your participation in the cycle, your connection to the community of the living and the dead. Time was not empty duration to be filled with personal projects, but a rich tapestry already woven, in which each life was a thread contributing to a design that had begun long ago and would continue long after. As the wheel turned and the seasons changed, as the feasts returned and the labors repeated, medieval people experienced time not as a problem to be solved, but as a gift to be received, not as a resource to be managed, but as a rhythm to be joined. This was the circular time of the medieval world, the eternal return that shaped everything from agriculture to theology, from memory to identity, from the ringing of the bells to the turning of the year. Yet even within this framework of bells and feasts and seasonal labors, there remained the texture of daily life, the countless small moments that filled the hours between the great markers. And here we encounter what might be the most profound difference between medieval and modern time: the absence of precision, the comfortable ambiguity that characterized ordinary temporal experience. Consider the simple act of arranging to meet someone. For us, this is a matter of specifying a time, often to the minute. We will meet at 2:30. We will arrive by 10:15. We set alarms and check watches and feel anxious if we are running late. The entire apparatus of modern life depends on this precision, on the assumption that everyone shares the same time and can coordinate their activities accordingly. But for medieval people, such precision was impossible. There were no watches, there were few clocks. The bells marked only certain hours, and those hours were themselves variable. How then did people arrange to meet? The answer is that they used approximations, descriptions, references to natural phenomena. We will meet when the sun is 3 hands above the horizon. We will meet at midday, when the shadows are shortest. We will meet after the bells ring for sext. We will meet when the market opens. These were not precise specifications but rough guidelines, understood by all parties to allow for considerable flexibility. This required patience. If you agreed to meet someone around midday, you might wait for what we would call an hour or more. There was no way to know if the other person was late, or if you were early, or if both of you were simply experiencing the inherent ambiguity of the arrangement. You waited, and eventually they arrived, or they did not, and life went on. This patience extended to all areas of life. Cooking without timers meant judging doneness by look and feel and smell, rather than by the clock. The bread was ready when it sounded hollow, the meat when it yielded to the knife, the stew when it tasted right. These were skills learned through experience, passed down through generations, requiring attention and judgment rather than mechanical precision. Travel without schedules meant accepting that journeys took as long as they took. You set out at dawn and traveled until dark, stopping when you found shelter, arriving when you arrived. The idea of being on time for a departure was meaningless when there were no fixed departure times. Ships sailed when the wind was right and the tide was favorable. Caravans left when they were ready. Individuals walked at their own pace. Work without shifts meant that labor was organized by task rather than by time. You worked until the job was done, or until darkness fell, or until you were too tired to continue. The concept of working hours, of being paid for time rather than for output, was largely foreign to the medieval world. A craftsman was paid for the product he made, not for the hours he spent making it. A laborer might be hired for the day, but the length of the day varied with the season and the nature of the work. This created a different relationship with time pressure. Medieval people certainly experienced urgency. The hay had to be brought in before the rain. The harvest had to be gathered before it spoiled. The journey had to be completed before winter closed the passes. But this urgency was tied to natural cycles and practical necessities, not to the abstract ticking of a clock. There was no sense of minutes slipping away, of being behind schedule, of time as a resource being wasted. The absence of precise timekeeping also affected social expectations. Punctuality, in our sense, was not a virtue because it was not possible. You could not be 5 minutes late when neither you nor the person waiting for you knew what 5 minutes meant. The whole moral framework around time, the judgment of those who waste it, the praise of those who use it efficiently, simply did not exist in its modern form. This is not to say that medieval people were indifferent to time or careless with their commitments. Reliability mattered. If you said you would do something, you were expected to do it. If you agreed to meet someone, you were expected to show up. But the standards were different, the tolerances wider, the expectations adjusted to the realities of a world without clocks. There was also less anxiety about time. The constant awareness of minutes passing, the feeling of being rushed, the guilt about time wasted, these are modern afflictions born of modern technology. Medieval people had their own anxieties, plenty of them, but the specific anxiety of clock time was not among them. Time passed, but it did not press. It flowed, but it did not race. The experience of duration was also different. Without clocks to measure it, time was judged by internal experience, by the feeling of how long something took. This is notoriously unreliable, as we know from modern psychology. Time flies when you are engaged and drags when you are bored. But in the medieval world, this subjective experience was the only experience available. Duration was not measured but felt, not quantified but lived. This created a more relaxed relationship with waiting. Waiting was simply part of life, not a problem to be solved or an inefficiency to be eliminated. You waited for the bread to bake, for the rain to stop, for the person to arrive, for the season to turn. Waiting was not wasted time but simply time, no different in kind from any other time. The modern horror of waiting, the desperate filling of every idle moment with activity or entertainment, would have been incomprehensible. The flexibility of medieval time also allowed for a different kind of presence. Without the constant checking of watches, the awareness of appointments looming, the mental calculation of how much time remained, people could be more fully where they were. A conversation did not have to end because someone had to be somewhere else at a specific moment. A meal did not have to be rushed because the clock was ticking. Life could unfold at its own pace, responsive to the needs of the moment rather than the demands of the schedule. Of course, this flexibility had its costs. Coordination was difficult. Efficiency, in the modern sense, was low. Projects took longer than they might have with better timekeeping. Trade and commerce were hampered by the impossibility of precise scheduling. The entire pace of economic life was slower than it would later become when clocks imposed their discipline. But for most medieval people, these costs were invisible, simply the way things were. They had no experience of a faster-paced, more precisely scheduled world, and therefore no sense of what they were missing. Their world worked well enough by its own standards, and those standards did not include the relentless optimization of time that characterizes modern life. The coming of mechanical clocks would change all this, gradually imposing a new discipline, a new precision, a new anxiety. But that transformation was still centuries away from completion. In the medieval world, time remained soft, flexible, approximate, a medium in which life unfolded rather than a measure by which it was judged. As the sun set and the bells rang for vespers, as the day's work ended and the evening meal was prepared, medieval people entered the quieter hours without checking the time, without calculating how long until bed, without the awareness of minutes that would characterize later ages. They simply lived in the evening, present to its particular quality, its gradual darkening, its transition from labor to rest. Time was not a number but an experience, not a constraint but a companion, not a problem but simply the medium of existence. The bells are still ringing, in some places. In monasteries where the ancient rule is still observed, the canonical hours are still marked, the psalms still chanted, the rhythm of prayer still structuring the day. In villages where the old churches still stand, the bells still call the faithful to worship, still mark the great feasts, still sound for weddings and funerals as they have for centuries. The sound carries across the landscape, reaching ears that may not consciously attend to it, creating a background awareness of sacred time that persists even in a secular age. The seasons still turn. The same labors still return, though now performed by machines more often than by human hands. The fields are still plowed in spring and harvested in autumn. The grapes are still pressed in their season. The rhythm of agricultural life, though transformed by technology, still follows the ancient pattern, still responds to the sun and the rain and the turning of the year. And somewhere, in the quiet moments between our scheduled appointments and our digital notifications, we might still catch an echo of that older time, a moment when the clock seems to stop, when duration stretches or contracts, according to our experience rather than the ticking of seconds. A moment when we are simply present, not calculating how much time we have or how we should use it, but just being in time as medieval people were in time, immersed in the medium rather than measuring it. The medieval experience of time offers us a counterpoint, not a model to be imitated, but a perspective from which to view our own assumptions. We take for granted that time is linear, that hours are equal, that precision is possible and desirable. We assume that time is a resource to be managed, that efficiency is a virtue, that every moment should be accounted for. But these are not eternal truths. They are the product of a particular history, the consequences of technologies and ideologies that have shaped our world in ways we rarely examine. The medieval world knew otherwise. It knew that time could bend to the sun, that hours could stretch and contract, that precision was often impossible and rarely necessary. It knew that time was not just measured but experienced, not just counted but lived. It knew that the rhythm of prayer and the cycle of seasons could provide a structure for life that did not depend on clocks and schedules. This does not mean that medieval time was better than modern time, any more than it was worse. It was different, shaped by different circumstances, serving different needs. The medieval world had its own problems, its own limitations, its own forms of suffering that we would not wish to restore. The precision of modern timekeeping has enabled coordination and efficiency on a scale that medieval people could not have imagined, making possible the complex systems on which our civilization depends. But the medieval experience reminds us that our way is not the only way. It suggests that the anxiety we feel about time, the constant pressure, the sense of never having enough, might not be inevitable features of human existence, but contingent products of our particular arrangements. It invites us to consider whether we might occasionally step out of clock time, even briefly, to experience duration in a more embodied, less measured way. The feasts still return, even if we no longer organize our calendars around them. Christmas and Easter still mark the turning of the year for millions. The seasons still change, even if we have insulated ourselves from their effects. The sun still rises and sets, even if we no longer depend on its light for our activities. The natural rhythms that structured medieval life have not disappeared. They have merely been overlaid with artificial rhythms, mechanical rhythms, digital rhythms that demand our attention and shape our experience. Perhaps there is wisdom in occasionally attending to the older rhythms, the ones that still pulse beneath the surface of our scheduled lives. Perhaps there is value in noticing the angle of the light, the length of the shadows, the position of the sun in the sky, not as information to be processed, but as experiences to be felt. Perhaps there is peace in letting time flow without constantly measuring it, in being present to duration without calculating it, in allowing the day to unfold without checking how much of it remains. The medieval world was not a paradise. It was hard and often brutal, marked by disease and famine and violence that we have largely escaped. Its temporal rhythms were embedded in structures of authority and belief that we might not wish to restore. The bells that marked the hours were also instruments of power. The feasts that structured the year were also mechanisms of control. The cycles that provided stability also limited possibility. But within those structures, medieval people found ways of living with time that we have largely lost. They found meaning in repetition, comfort in return, identity in participation. They experienced time as something shared rather than private, as something given rather than made, as something sacred rather than merely secular. They lived in time rather than against it, with time rather than racing it, through time rather than watching it slip away. As we move through our own days, measured and scheduled and optimized, we might occasionally pause to listen for the bells. Not literal bells, perhaps, though those still ring in some places, but the deeper rhythm they represented, the rhythm of sacred time, of communal time, of time that bends to nature and connects to eternity. That rhythm has not entirely disappeared. It still sounds, faintly, beneath the noise of our digital age, waiting to be heard by those who have ears for it. The medieval year has ended, but it has not concluded. It continues as it always has, in the turning of the seasons, in the returning of the feasts, in the ancient patterns that still shape our world even when we do not notice them. The past is not gone, but always present, woven into the fabric of our experience, echoing in the sounds and rhythms we have inherited from those who came before. And so we leave the medieval world, but we do not entirely depart from it. We carry its rhythms with us, hidden in our calendars and our customs, embedded in our language and our expectations. The bells still ring somewhere, the seasons still turn. The wheel of time still revolves, carrying us through the same positions our ancestors knew, connecting us to all who have lived and all who will live, weaving our individual moments into the great tapestry of human time. In the end, we are all participants in the same ancient cycle, all listeners to the same distant bells, all travelers through the same turning year that our medieval forebears knew, marked not by the ticking of clocks but by the deeper rhythms of light and darkness, labor and rest, memory and hope, the endless returning of what has been and what will be again.